Fantastic. We are going to start our session. So, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, colleagues, good afternoon and welcome. A warm welcome as well to our online audience. My name is Nathalie Delorme. I am from the UN Geneva's Beyond Lab, and it is an honor to be moderating the session here today at UNCTAD 16. The session is entitled Reshaping Progress, Moving Beyond GDP for Inclusive and Sustainable Transformation. The global community, through the Pact for the Future and SDG 17, has called for new metrics that capture what truly matters when measuring progress towards sustainable development. This is not only a technical exercise. It is about reimagining progress in a way that is inclusive, sustainable, and centered on human and planetary well-being. The objective is to develop metrics that go beyond GDP, bridging the information gap to guide smarter policies, investments, and economic transformation for intergenerational equity for current and future generations. At the United Nations, this process is led by an independent high-level expert group on Beyond GDP, appointed by the UN Secretary General and supported by UN Trade and Development, the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, the UN Development Programme, as well as the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Today's discussion is also about momentum and leadership. Around the world, countries and institutions are already moving beyond GDP, integrating the multidimensional nature of sustainable development into their policy frameworks. These experiences show that when we measure what truly matters, we make better decisions for today and for tomorrow. We are also expanding partnerships to engage new voices across generations. At the Beyond Lab, in close partnership with UN Trade and Development, as well as Rethinking Economics, we are actively working together on a youth network to move beyond GDP. The objective is to empower young people to break the current intergenerational glass ceiling in economic discourse, and to ensure their meaningful and sustained participation into these processes. Today, we will hear from national and institutional leaders who are charting this new course. And together, we will explore how to scale these innovations, share lessons, and shape a new global narrative of progress. A new narrative that recenters development around people and the planet. And with that, let us begin. For this first opening panel, and to help us answer these questions, 5 distinguished panelists will offer their national institutional experiences in advancing the use of new metrics. We are joined by His Excellency, Mr. Namgyal Dorji, Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Employment of the Kingdom of Bhutan, Ms. Mary Beth Goodman, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, Ms. Nora Listic, Professor Emerita of Economics and co-chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert panel on Beyond GDP, Her Excellency, Ms. Dima Al-Yahya, Secretary General of the Digital Cooperation Organization, and Ms. Rebecca Grinspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD, who will join us right after opening a ministerial segment. Each of our 5 distinguished panelists will offer a 4-minute intervention to help us frame today's discussions. And before we'll start, I will have to start with a kind reminder to please keep interventions within the allocated time. This will really help us ensure that all voices are heard and that we sustain a dynamic, inclusive, and substantive exchange. We greatly appreciate your cooperation in helping us shape this debate. Your Excellency, Minister, Bhutan has long championed the concept of gross national happiness as an alternative measure of progress. How can Bhutan's experience help inspire a renewed global shift to development that integrates well-being, ecological balance, and cultural values into policymaking and international cooperation? Over to you.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be joining distinguished list of speakers and experts here on a subject very close to my heart. Thank you Well, like you said, Bhutan's journey with gross national happiness, or GNH we call, began nearly half a century ago with a very simple yet very revolutionary question of a sort. While asking, should progress be measured only by what we produce, or also by how we live and what we value most? So that has been the central question. Nearly 50 years ago, I was saying in the 1970s, when the former king, His Majesty, the fourth king of Bhutan, was asked by a few international journalists, then curious to know about this country called Bhutan. Their question, very much reflected the period in time when growth was mostly seen from the GDP metric, an era literally obsessed with GDP growth. They asked, what is the GDP of Bhutan? And His Majesty responded that, well, for Bhutan, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. Those words became, when we reflect now, truly a turning point, not just how Bhutan approached economic growth from the very early stage of our modern economic development, but also marked Bhutan's contribution to the global discourse on finding balance between prosperity and purpose, growth and well-being, that we are all engaged right now. So Bhutan's lesson, well, our GNH philosophy, or the well-being, it's deeply rooted in balance, in essence, between material advancement and spiritual well-being, between individual ambition and collective harmony. So over a time of 5 decades, we translated those philosophy into policy, law, and also a scientific way of measuring those. What does this entail in real policy terms? We also learned and continues to share our experience of making values measurable. Every policy and plan in Bhutan that the government implements goes through a kind of a policy screening tools that measures not just in terms of the real economic impact that certain policy would bring, but rather the impact on community vitality, cultural preservation, environment, good governance, and the list goes on. So, and we also then discovered that happiness and productivity can very much go together. Our transformation, all the development pursuits are built on our priority on renewable energy, digital innovation, creative industries. So these are all being pursued from tourism. All these, in essence, carry approach that is value-based, and we also then understand that what the world needs is to understand that resilience, all set, lies in the balance very much that I just mentioned above. Now, what from our experience, and now that especially we have the UN Secretary General's expert group working on the Beyond GDP project, what little from our own experience that we want to share here is that whatever metrics you develop, whatever measurement and scientific tools you propose, these all measurements must serve meaning at the end. Indicators must recenter policy on people and planet, not the other way around. People and planet shouldn't be compromised for the sake of creating new policies, a new way of doing things. It should rather really serve, like the moderator mentioned at the end, truly care for the people and then the planetary boundaries. And importantly, development financing, I should say, finance must follow new metrics. International cooperation should reward sustainability, inclusion and well-being, not just GDP growth indicators. World Bank, IMF, ADB, the financing, especially for developing countries, when you undertake projects for development financing, these metrics should be considered. And importantly, culture must guide cooperation. All countries have unique cases. Each has their own definition, progress, of measuring, and one size fits all measures should not be, kind of literally imposed. So each country must be, each society must be free to localize its own definition of progress. I think, for now, I'll leave here. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for these remarks and this important reminder to center metrics around values, as well as recentering policies around people and planet. Professor Lustig, as co-chair of the already mentioned UN high-level expert group on Beyond GDP, how are you balancing exactly what the minister just said? How are you balancing the need for metrics to be both ambitious and universally applicable to all countries? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning, good evening for those of us who are following us online. Thank you very much for having us today. I am sort of perturbing the protocol here because I wanted to share a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's been there. I like to leave a tangible thing after my intervention so people can go back and look at it and then, come back to us and discuss it. So this high-level group was established by the Secretary General in May of this year, and the task is daunting and the time is short. So we are trying to work as hard as we can to actually fulfill all the expectations that people have put on us. Now this is not moving, so.
Our colleagues are happy to move to the slide
All right.
for you.
This is us. So you have to discount the minutes that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So it's not in presentation mode, but this is us. We're 14 academics and practitioners. It's a combination that's helpful because we bring different things. I've been an academic and a practitioner in international organizations, so I had worn both hats. It's very diverse. I always say, the Stiglitz NF2C Commission had just one woman. Now, we've made progress. There is more gender balance in our group than it used to be the case before. Next, please. This is a question, so you already saw it. So why Beyond GDP? It's already been explained, but GDP is a measure of economic activity, but it doesn't really measure well-being. It doesn't measure equity and inclusiveness, and it doesn't measure sustainability. This has created many initiatives that have tried to approach the challenge of measuring progress differently in academia, governments, and multilateral organizations. I mentioned some of them. Next, please. Why doesn't it work?
Sorry about
that. All right. So the meaning of Beyond GDP for us is that GDP is a measure of material economic activity, but not necessarily of material well-being broadly understood. So we have to use other indicators to measure material well-being. We have to go beyond income to include the non-income dimensions. We have to go beyond averages to include equity and inclusion, and we have to go beyond today to ensure economic, social, and environmental sustainability in the future. Next, please. We strive for, these are kind of like the principles that we are trying to sort of incorporate in our vision. It's making the invisible visible, giving voice to the voiceless, and making the implicit explicit. So we'll bring in all the discussions and make transparent assertions about what the limitations of the different approaches are so people can understand when they make a choice, what choice they're making. Next, please. We build on the existing consensus to value what counts. Fortunately, there is consensus, so we're happy. Then we have to build on the indicators that were selected in previous efforts, universal efforts that are available. That's the main challenge, and here I would like to put that on the table very forcefully. We also look at the methods that have been proposed to aggregate indicators into composite indices. And very importantly, lessons learned from previous Beyond GDP initiatives in terms of content and uptake. Even though countries have uptaken the Beyond GDP agenda, it has not been uptaken at the universal level to get indicators that have the same prestige as GDP. That's our goal, as I will repeat again. So the 4 minutes are gone, but
Please take your time.
yeah, okay. Please, next. So we use a tripartite framework, and this is very similar to many of the frameworks that have been put forward, and that's reassuring. We're not going to have to discuss that very much. You know, the current well-being, we measure what societies and individuals have at present. Inclusiveness and equity, we want to know how that well-being is distributed in societies, both in terms of vertical inequalities and horizontal inequalities, which include gender, ethnicity, and other variables that, depending on the country, people may want to know, across nations, of course. And the sustainability, which we want to look at also in terms of short-term and long-term sustainability, not just long-term, and how, you know, that bill sort of spills over international cooperation and the production of public goods, which is very important for the sustainability. Next, please. What are the two, if you want, more universally accepted initiatives? It's the SDGs. The SDGs, like I say, is the mother of all dashboards, but 200 and so much indicators makes it hard to assess progress and to select. So we need to be much more parsimonious in terms of the indicators that we want to accept. And remember that when you use a dashboard, the challenge is how you measure progress. Yeah. Some things can go up, some things can go down, and I'd be interested to learn how do you deal with that in Bhutan. But you can have targets, and you can say, okay, am I getting closer or not to the targets? This is some of the indicators in the SDGs have that, and that's great. The other, please next, the other important initiative that has taken hold at the more universal level, there are many, you know, like I said, local, government, et cetera, but it's the HDI, the Human Development Index. It's a composite indicator. It has more than income, which is good. And, you know, then progress is easy to measure because it depends on the number that you have for that indicator. They don't have the challenge that you have with a dashboard. So the advantages are there. The disadvantage is that at present, the HDI doesn't capture cumulative deprivation. So you have country-based indicators, but you don't know to what extent the same deprivations are concentrated on the same people or different people. And that's an important thing to incorporate. It doesn't also capture the extent to which people may be below a certain threshold. Even the HDI that's adjusted for inequality doesn't do that. I know they incorporate the MPI as part of their repertoire, but not the HDI. No? And the externally chosen weights maybe are viewed sometimes as paternalistic, which is something that also is very interesting of how you dealt with in Bhutan, rather than being endogenously determined by society. Next. Then in academia, I think there are two big lines that have been pursued. One is the equivalent income approach that's preference-based. The problem is that it's individualistic, and I don't think it works when you talk about deprivations because those are not preferences, those are constraints. So we don't want to have to choose the value of health based on a tragic choice for people who are very poor. So we're aware of that. And the next effort that I think has been very important is the next one, the capabilities approach, which has been applied primarily by the MPI group. And since Sabina will speak later, I will leave it to her to discuss what they're proposing. But that's, you know, the other one that we consider a big effort in academia. The next, please. So what's the task in front of us? And with this, I finish. We have to produce a dashboard. That's what in our terms of reference is to produce a dashboard of no more than 20 indicators, as little as possible. And please, this is very important to bear in mind. We're not going to be able to include all the favorite indicators of everybody. So you have to put yourself in our shoes and say, this is what I really want to see. We want them to be parsimonious so that they can be collected and given the same prestige as GDP. The goal is to have domains and indicators that will help policymakers to make decisions with social criteria, addressing the constraints and promoting well-being for everybody today and tomorrow. And then, in particular, right now, I can tell you what we think about the indicators that we will be including. Will they include the concept of valued, equitable, and sustainable GDP? Yes. Will they include non-income dimensions? Yes. Will they reflect horizontal and vertical inequalities up front? Yes. Will we measure current well-being and sustainability with different indicators? Yes. Will indicators capture cumulative deprivations, as I said earlier, or countrywide measures? Both. Will they be individual or society level? Both. Will they differ depending on the level of development? Yes. I think we need to combine universality and flexibility, and that's going to be another challenge. Will we propose methods to aggregate them into composite indicators? Yes. Outlining what are the advantages and disadvantages of the different methodologies. With this, I end, and the next slide shows you our website in case you want to visit us. And my next slide says, thank you, gracias, in many different languages. If you want to contribute with your own language, please send it to me. Thank you very much.
I'm going to contribute in German as a German speaking.
Danke.
So vielen Dank.
I had danke.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Lustig, for really giving us this comprehensive, extremely helpful overview, as well as actually we got first insights into the initial indicators of the high-level expert group. With that, Ms. Goodman, the OECD is a global leader in advancing the well-being framework and beyond GDP indicators. From your perspective, what institutional or policy shifts are most needed to mainstream these approaches so that governments, investors, businesses alike make decisions that reflect people's well-being and planetary health? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I love seeing the room so full and the energy around this issue. We have spent a lot of time, the original Stiglitz report was obviously done at the OECD, and we've continued to do this work and to build out some of the focus. And one of the things that we have learned is that to truly reshape the progress in this space, the most important institutional shift is to treat well-being and sustainability not as add-ons to policy, but as the goal of the policy itself. And that is a fundamental premise that we believe is really some of the bedrock here. But it's not easily done, of course, right? This means that governments, investors, businesses, and how they define success and how they make the decisions every day really does need to evolve. For governments, I'm going to point 3 key shifts that we think can have some impact here. Governments, this means that a whole of government coordination around shared well-being and environmental objectives. It's not enough for the ministries of finance or the Ministry of Environment to focus on this. It needs to be a more comprehensive effort and not acted on alone. Countries that are making real progress actually have formal mechanisms to align policies with long-term well-being. We've seen cabinet-level coordination in Wales and well-being informing the budget processes in Canada, Italy, and Japan, just as some examples among our members. The second big shift is using beyond GDP data as the evidence base for decision-making. And I know some of you might say, of course, the OECD person is talking about the data, but we really believe in the data and how it can inform the decisions. But it matters. It is fundamental to getting that policy shift and broader buy-in in governments. So when governments use metrics that capture the quality of people's health and the health on the planet, not just outputs, then they're able to make better choices. As an example of this, measuring the value of biodiversity helps balance short-term pressures to boost agricultural production with the long-term need to protect the ecosystems that sustain it. And we've seen some of those trade-offs. Another example, data on child poverty and inequality of opportunity can inform more targeted social policies that actually reduce crisis spending and strengthen overall resilience. The third shift for government involves independent accountability. Several countries have actually established commissions, or in some instances called them offices of future generations. What an amazing title that is for a cabinet office or for offices in government. The purpose of these is to ensure that today's policies do not compromise tomorrow's well-being. It's that fundamental. But these institutions bring the continuity across the political cycles, something that, frankly, economies currently urgently need. But we also have to look at business and investors. And businesses and the investors also have a really vital role to play. Increasingly, companies understand that social and environmental sustainability is good for business. And in recent OECD survey data of firms in Latin America and the Caribbean, 3/4 of the businesses surveyed said that the responsible business conduct actually helped them anticipate and mitigate supply chain risk during the COVID-19 pandemic. Investors, workers, and consumers are actually demanding this accountability, and forward-looking companies are actually responding. Much of our work is trying to support some of this in very practical ways. For over a decade, we've had our OECD well-being framework that has provided governments with a multidimensional view of progress across 15 areas, looking at income, to health, to environment, to social connections. And while none of our members currently have the record of Bhutan with a national gross happiness metric here, 2/3 of our OECD members now have national well-being initiatives that are incorporated into their policy, and many of them are using the same framework. So through this effort, we're also engaging directly with the private sector. We have a Business for Inclusive Growth Coalition, and we have a Council for Inclusive Capitalism, right? And while that title may seem a little odd, it is symbolic of the fact that businesses are opening the aperture and pulling more into this. And the efforts here are helping the firms measure and report on their social and environmental impact using some of the non-financial performance frameworks that we have. Ultimately, the people-centered development with planetary boundaries is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and we need more governments and businesses to realize this. The challenge for all of us is how to make this mindset the norm across the institutions that are shaping all of our economies. And that is how we're really going to truly move beyond GDP and towards policy that can sustain both people and the planet. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman, for these really 3 very concrete shifts for government, but also the strong call to include business. Your Excellency, Ms. Al-Yahya, digital transformation is reshaping economies worldwide, yet digital divides persist. How can digital cooperation and inclusive technologies be harnessed to actually drive equitable, sustainable economic transformation, particularly for developing countries and marginalized communities? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Natalie, for first for inviting us to this amazing roundtable. It's great to be here with thought leaders and thinkers talking about a very important subject. And what better to end this panel with digital. Digital economy is now the new source of the future economy. While we are embracing such kind of economy and providing or harnessing the opportunities behind it, there is a lot of challenges that we should be addressing now before the divide increases, especially with AI now being used. So digital transformation is one of the most powerful forces of that's reshaping our world. It is redefining how we learn, how we work, how we produce and measure progress. But as we gather here to look beyond GDP, it is clear that digitization is not only an economic metrics. It is a human story, a story about opportunity, equity, and inclusion. Yet, this story remains unfinished because of the widening of the digital divide. Today, nearly 1 in 3 people in the world remain offline, most of them in developing countries. But connectivity is not only the beginning. There are divides within the divide, between men and women, for instance, between urban and rural, the digital skills divide, and increasingly between as well traditional technologies and now introducing of the access of artificial intelligence. Women are 14% less likely than men to use mobile internet in low and medium income countries. These differences create an economical also divide as well. Rural areas continue to lag by more than 30% points in broadband coverage compared to cities. And in 2024, over 70% of global private AI investment went just to 2 countries, leaving the rest of the world on the margins of AI revolution. If left unaddressed, these gaps will widen, and it will be more difficult to mitigate, and also the effect of it on GDP will be very difficult for us to contain. GDP may rise with digital economy, but is it equal? But well-being will not follow if millions remain excluded from the tools of digital economy. To go beyond GDP is therefore to recognize that the true prosperity lies not only in the volume of the data that we produce, but in the breadth of people empowered. The solution lies in cooperation. Digital cooperation that builds bridges, borders, sectors, and societies. By aligning standards, sharing infrastructure, and co-investing in digital skills, nations can ensure that technology serves as an equalizer rather than a divider. In fact, job descriptions jobs will be affected by 2030. We look at 170 million new jobs being created and 92 million jobs being displaced, resulting in a net of a gain, actually, an increase of 78 million jobs. These shifts, driven by technological advancements, geographic change, and global economic pressures, will redefine the every structure of economics. Managing this transformation will depend on an unprecedented cooperation among governments, businesses, and international organizations to ensure that no nation or community is left behind. Cooperation must be action-oriented, rooted in shared accountability and measured outcomes. We must enable inclusion in every digital policy, sustainability in every innovation, and trust in every technological exchange. As we rethink what progress means, let us not move from being accountable for measuring that impact and making sure that we all are serving the humanity equally and providing the right inclusive opportunity through digital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this important reminder of the divides within the divides, as well as the solution that action-oriented cooperation is, serving as an equalizer, and as you put it so brilliantly, telling the human story behind these metrics. With that, I can start with a very warm welcome to the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Ms. Greenspan. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So UNCTAD co-leads the UN efforts to develop these measures of progress beyond GDP, including as serving as the co-secretariat of the high-level expert group on Beyond GDP. In your view, why is it important to develop these metrics and reshape progress and policies to focus on people and planet? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you very much, and it's so good to be here. I don't know, you are finishing or everybody has already... So I see very good friends, and very expert friends. So let me give some general comments on this exercise. Well, first of all, let me begin by saying that we are not trying to substitute GDP. Yes, that was a discussion. It's not that it was obvious from the beginning, but I think that the decision that was taken, that really we need an instrument to better decision making and not to, to try to substitute one indicator with the other, etc., that will leave us not only a very long process, but not necessarily a successful one because it has been tried before. And I think that we have to understand also that the GDP is useful. The problem is when we think that GDP is everything, but it's a useful tool. And it really came about after the Second World War when we had a real data gap. And so the GDP was developed and it remains valuable today, not least because it compiles to a globally agreed standard, but also that standard has been updated, and so it has a function to play. What we don't want is for policymakers to continue to think that the only thing they have to look at is GDP. It's also a problem, and here that I have Sabina with us, it happens the same when we measure poverty. I remember when we had these discussions, no? And we said, well, we don't want only a photograph. We want a movie. We don't want us to tell us what the situation is in one moment, because then you lose information to take decisions from how the evolution have been. And with the multi-dimensional measures of poverty, we were able to have a different way of looking at poverty and to have a much more rich set of indicators that will tell us more to take better decisions. And I think that we are in the same situation here. GDP right now really accounts for transactions. Yes, it measures transactions, and sometimes we confuse transactions with progress. And that's what we are trying to avoid. And the obvious examples that we have always given on this is that GDP assigns zero value to the Amazon rainforest unless we cut it down. And so we have a problem, yes, in terms of the measurement. So this is the first thing. How can we have a set of indicators that are more not only about goods and services in the market, but development that is about people and their well-being, yes? And beyond GDP is about bridging this gap, about making the invisible visible, about measuring development with development. Now, the member states have bought this idea, and so that's very good because it has a process in the UN. And in the Pact of the Future, they decided to establish this high-level expert group on beyond GDP, and we are proud, as was said, that we co-lead this work as a co-secretariat with DESA and with UNDP. And Anu is here with us, and many of you have seen her acting very strongly on this area and leading a lot of the work that is being done. Now, you can ask me, why the high expert group? And I will tell you, because there is a lot to be discussed that has to count with the expertise, the analysis, bringing everybody together. This is not a very easy exercise, yes? Choosing indicators, we all know, is not easy, and choosing the areas for the indicators so we don't end up with 1 million that are unmanageable. And that balance is not easy. And also because we need knowledge to have this a rational conversation and a productive one, let's put it that way. And then, obviously, the commissions of the Statistical Commission will have to evaluate the recommendation of the high-level expert group. We will try to socialize as much as possible this discussion. And the Statistical Commission will have then to take the decisions with respect to the new measurements. But the other point that maybe we are not talking about that today, but is how we build capacity in the countries to be able to have an exercise that will help them, because this is not to help us. Yes, this is to help them. And so it will be very important that we start very early talking to the countries, strengthening their statistical capacity, for them to be able also to participate in a better way later on, but also that they will be able to use the indicators. We all know the problems that we have with respect to that. One, even when we talk about the indicators in the SDGs, that was a huge exercise, yes? We know that in many indicators, maybe we don't have the perfect indicator. The question is if we have a good indicator, even if it's not perfect. And part of the problem is that we go for the minimum common denominator many times, because there are never enough effort, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, not a UN opinion, but we don't make enough efforts to build more the capacity before we are in front of already a problem that we have to solve. And so maybe sometimes it's too late to make it work. So I will make these 2 points. We have to be very clear of what we want to do. We want to help policymakers and actors in society to take better decisions, to widen the way in which they look at progress, so we can look at real progress and for the well-being of people. And this is a hugely important exercise. On the other hand, we have to build the capacities of the countries to really participate in this exercise and to be able to use whatever will be the result in a better way for the improvement of their development, planning processes, and their people. And I will leave you with these 2 tasks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Greenspan. And this very important call to making the invisible visible, and actually how to build the capacities to do so, with the ultimate decision, as you've perfectly framed it, to help decision and policymakers make better decisions. And with that, I am actually going to literally move to the next panel. I hope you will still be able to hear me as I do so. And perhaps to quote His Excellency the Minister Dorji, really continue asking, you put it, these revolutionary questions. So this second segment will help us go deeper into the practical frontier. How do we translate these frameworks into economic systems, into national planning, into budget decisions? If we succeed, beyond GDP metrics will drive transformation, guiding fiscal, social, and environmental policies alike. For this second panel, and to unpack these questions, we are very pleased to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Matthew Wilson, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Barbados to the United Nations, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva, Ms. Sabina Al-Khair, Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at Oxford University, Ms. Peggy Hicks, Director of the Thematic Engagement Division at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Rutger Hodska, Associate Professor at the Institute for Environmental Sciences, at Leiden University, and Mr. Max Amanu, Development Economist and a representative of the Youth Network on Beyond GDP. Each of our distinguished panelists will offer a 3-minute intervention for 2 rounds of questions. And as we begin, I will have to start again with a very kind and gentle reminder to our panelists to keep intervention limited to this very short time. This will allow us again to accommodate all perspectives and ensure a well-paced interactive discussion. So thank you in advance for your cooperation in making this both a substantive and engaging debate. And I will start with the first round of questions and then open the floor for the second round of questions to come from you, from the audience. I'll start with you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Wilson. Small island developing states like Barbados are on the front lines of climate vulnerability, debt distress, and uneven access to finance. What structural reforms at a global level are most needed to make economic transformation genuinely equitable and responsive to these realities?
Thank you so much. And I love the way you move from one side to the other, you know. It's both modern, old-fashioned, and charming. I love it. So listen, I'm going to do what most ambassadors do, which is completely ignore the question and say what I want to say. But I'm truly, truly happy that we're having this discussion today, because I think in this period of time where there is a crisis of multilateralism, UN80 is happening, this is exactly what we need to be discussing. What a future, more holistic approach to progress could look like. And I do believe that the future has got to be governed by concepts, by indicators, and by evidence that does look at growth and development beyond these very simple economic numbers and this very simple indicator of GDP. And, you know, listening to my other panelists, I'm really happy that you put some guardrails around the number of indicators as well, because it's really important that we be as precise and focused as possible. Now, small countries like Barbados, we've been advocating for this kind of holistic approach for decades. If you look at the SIDS work program in the UN, in UNCTAD, in WTO, it's all about understanding growth from different and multiple dimensions. Because we know that growth without resilience is like building a sandcastle on a beach. And I have to say that this strict approach to GDP and GDP per capita has been quite disastrous for some of our small countries, because it has locked us completely out of grant funding and concessional funding as well. Now, I read somewhere recently that the idea of beyond GDP is to, and I want to get this right, to correct the blind spot in measuring economic prosperity, which is great, and also to improve national statistical accounting to measure what we value, which is in a way what the SG just hinted at. And I could not think of a better description for what it is we're trying to do here. Now, I want to say 4 things. First, you have to own your own narrative. And this is why Barbados, a very small country, created the Bridgetown Initiative. And I know all of you here know about the Bridgetown Initiative, which is now in its 3rd incarnation. It's been very impactful. And this was an example of a small state with a very big leader leading the charge to transform the international financial architecture through dialogue, through partnership, and through advocacy. And I see the exact same culture when I listen to the minister from Bhutan. And I echo, Minister, 2 things that you said in particular. Finance must follow new metrics, and indicators must recenter on people and planet. So thank you. Second, be very clear on what you want and why. And very few people were making that link between economic growth, vulnerability, and resilience. And that is a massive part of, for small states, this issue of resilience, especially those who are climate vulnerable and debt-ridden. Because again, it's very difficult for us to access finance on concessional terms. Now, I don't know if debt came up, but we have to talk about debt. Actually, it did come up yesterday in all of the high-level speakers that we heard in the morning. Every single one of them, from Barbados to Vietnam to Timor-Leste, mentioned debt. Because excessive debt burdens makes it impossible to reinvest in social services, in transport, in health, in gender equality, in long-term development. So part of this for the international architecture to think about is debt relief and restructuring mechanisms that really, really help countries like mine adopt these alternative economic models that do prioritize sustainability and social equity. But we need the international financial architecture of the regional development banks to play a very big part here. They are the ones who will provide the pathways for countries to access the funding that we need and to lean into some of the new elements that we've seen come about, like green and new bonds, for example, or debt for nature swaps, or other initiatives that are being piloted by a number of SIDS, actually. Now, time will tell how successful some of these initiatives are, but already through the Bridgetown Initiative, we've had some beautiful new concepts like natural disaster pauses and clauses in loan agreements, which really do provide a real sense of insurance and comfort. Now, we also have got to keep our eye on agencies like the World Bank. You know, many of you would have seen recent statements that have been made at the recent World Bank meetings. We cannot have the World Bank turn its back on climate financing and climate support. We simply cannot afford for that to happen. So shared advocacy around this issue is going to be important. Third, we need to take a really hard look at our narrative. As a negotiator, I can tell you that there are two ways to look at success, or rather, two ways I look at success. Maintaining those who agree with you and convincing those who don't. I am beginning to feel that those of us who believe in the need to have alternative metrics and measures are increasingly speaking in an echo chamber. And we have to be real careful about that, because we know what speaking in an echo chamber results in. Shocks, because you things happen and you think, well, how on earth did this happen? Because we're not always talking to the right people. Huh? So we need to engage more with the skeptics who may not care or may not understand why we need to look at things like nature-based policies and nature-based solutions, and why we need to look at issues like gender equality and health. We need to engage those skeptics. We also need to ask the tough questions like, why has the market failed to fill the gap left by development assistance withdrawals? Have we been effective in helping them to see the economic and social rewards in investing based on beyond GDP metrics? So I think there's a lot of work to do there. And this is why through the Bridgetown Initiative, we're very much engaging with the insurance industry, for example, to show them that it makes sense for them to invest in climate resilience, ultimately because it helps to reduce the burden on the insurance companies as well. And then have we engaged intergenerationally? And I'm really happy we have a youth on our panel. I know it will not be performative. So I'm really happy that you're here, because I feel that with the passions and frankly, the investment decisions that we need the youth to make in the future, we need to engage them from today. So I'm really happy to hear about the Youth Network. My only hope is that it goes deep. It goes deep and it touches the voices of the youth who are usually not heard. And I'm not talking about the youth who are privileged enough to be in these spaces. We need to reach those who are usually do not have access to these rooms. Those are the voices that we need to hear more from. And fourth and finally, we need our development agencies like UNCTAD to actively support developing these indicators to make sure that they're clear and they're appealing. Because the beautiful thing about GDP and GDP per capita is that it's so clear and it's so appealing to the lowest common denominator. But that's not what we need if we're truly going to reflect and measure progress. And like the SG said, it has got to become part of the DNA of our national accounting, our national statistics, our national legislation, and that's going to take some real active and intentional work. And, you know, frankly, I think this is part of helping the world to recenter on its axis, because I think it's gone a little bit haywire of late. There's this seventh generational principle, which I'm sure many of you know, by the indigenous Iroquois, who said that decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. So for me, looking beyond GDP is a very smart, but small, but important step in getting us on that ladder of thinking more long-term and for future generations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I probably shouldn't say this as a moderator, but with the power of your intervention, thank you for going off script. And you will also be very pleased to hear that actually the Youth Network on Beyond GDP is joining us online as we continue to fight to democratize these spaces and enable access, exactly as you said, that is meaningful, sustained, and really transformative. Professor Alkire, I'm turning to you. As the architect of the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and we've already heard references to it, you've demonstrated how going beyond income can reshape our understanding of progress. In your view, what are the main challenges in translating this broader vision of well-being into systemic economic transformation at both national and international levels? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's really good to be here and to learn from you. If I think of what will make a well-being measure useful for policy, I have to first acknowledge that it is difficult, and if it were easy, it would have been done. And it will require brave decisions, and as Nora said, it will also not be satisfactory to everybody, so we'll have to give space and find out what would be useful. But from our experience as people who try to work with governments on poverty and a little bit on GNH or multidimensional well-being, there are 4 criteria that I think would be useful. One is having actionable indicator level decisions. The second is being able to look within country at poor and vulnerable groups. The third is not being paternalistic, but being consonant with different ideas of the good. You can't impose your idea on me. And the fourth is looking at those left behind in many indicators at the same time. So how does that work in terms of measurement? First, as Nora said, for indicators, for elements of a multidimensional well-being measure beyond GDP, each indicator should be actionable. What is sufficient is the question in Bhutan's GNH index. It's not, can we have an average of years of schooling that includes people with 3 PhDs and people who never went to school. It's 10th class or a graduate completing education degree for each person as a middle class measure, as a sufficiency cutoff. The second is to be able to go within countries, and this is the most difficult in terms of data, and I'll come back to the end to 2 final questions. One is data. But can we look by gender, by age cohort, by location, by occupation, by disability status, by ethnicity, at intra-household, intra-country inclusion? And I think that's very pertinent, where you can see the places where well-being is falling short. You can invest subnationally. For national policy, to have one number for the government is not very actionable. In multidimensional poverty measures, it's the subnational information that's very actionable. Third, freedom. If everybody has to be good at everything, we're just a Renaissance society. If we just have a basic core of indicators, we might not capture things that are really important to subsegments of the population. In Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index, they strive to provide 2/3 of the sufficiency in domains to people as the causes of well-being, the last mile being themselves. In multidimensional poverty, if you have a package of deprivations at the same time, not just one, then you are understood to be poor, and these are not spurious nor willfully chosen. So we need some way of avoiding paternalism so that everybody doesn't have to be good at everything. And on our planet, it may not be possible also. The last criteria is interconnections, or what Nora mentioned as cumulative. If a person is falling behind in one indicator versus in 7, it's quite different. And so being able to look across them and identify those being left behind in several at the same time is important. It also recycles what we learned in the SDGs. Breaking silos is actually cost efficient. Multisectoral integrated programs do more with less money, and we need that at this time. So those are 4 criteria: having a sufficiency cutoff, what is enough, so each indicator is actionable, looking within countries at different groups, not being paternalistic, but allowing different ways of well-being to flourish and recognized, and looking at cumulative. This leads me to 2 final questions. One is data and one is clarity. Will the Beyond GDP group use existing data and put their effort into making the best measure? Or will they try to change the data environment and have one Beyond GDP data source? I don't know. Neither are easy, but it's a question somewhat up the 4 where you go on that fork of the road depends the measures you can make. And the second is clarity. As Matt said, we want to measure that the youth of the Beyond GDP network can use. On an app on their phone, if there's a counting-based measure, they can answer it, and they know if they themselves have well-being by a national measure. If you have a composite where you need the average of everybody else, then you have no idea how you fit in. So ways that NGOs, that youth, that others can engage so that success can have many parents, I think is vital for this work. I don't know the answers, the questions are too difficult, but these might be some considerations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your considerations, Professor Alkire. And I'd like, I think, just to reiterate this beautiful point of saying success can have many different parents. And you'll also be very pleased to hear that Professor Lustig is actually going to share closing reflections for today's event to really capture what was discussed here. Ms. Hicks, the human rights community has been discussing Beyond GDP, most recently actually last week, here in Geneva. So from a human rights lens, how can the shift Beyond GDP strengthen accountability for social justice and equality, ensuring, we've heard it, that these measures of progress reflect human dignity, inclusion, and the rights of the most marginalized groups? Over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be with you all as well. As Natalie has said, obviously GDP is a critical agenda for human rights, and we recognize that, and it's come through all of the earlier statements, so I don't need to say much more. But the gaps in GDP have real human rights consequences, and that's very important for us to emphasize. Ambassador Wilson pointed to access to concessional and development and climate finance, for example, as one of those areas that we feel very acutely. As noted, we had a roundtable last week on Beyond GDP and Human Rights with UNCTAD, the Beyond Lab, and very fortunate to have 3 members of the high-level expert group working with us as well, and was co-sponsored by a group of states that are all very supportive of this work. And I want to share a few insights from that conversation to sort of anchor these points. I have 5 of them. I'm going to try to stay within time. So what we wanted to look at, a key takeaway from that roundtable, was that the design of new measurements, such as those on well-being, will vary by context, and this goes to the point made by the minister at the outset, but they can vary, but they need to be grounded in internationally recognized human rights standards. And that's because that will be helpful to all of those to give them legitimacy, accountability, and coherence across the universal approach. Secondly, it's important to note, and this goes to your point, Sabine, as well, that we're not starting from scratch. States already use universal human rights indicators to assess living standards, working conditions, environmental impacts, and public participation. But those are all key, as we've seen, to measuring how fair and sustainable an economy is. The third point that I want to emphasize coming out of that conversation is this idea that Beyond GDP is not just another conversation about metrics. And we heard this at the outset, and I just want to reemphasize it, that what's at stake is a fundamental rethinking of what the economy is for. I mean, that seems ambitious, but if there's ever a moment where we need that conversation, it's today, when we see the rise of inequality and we see the impact of the climate crisis. So this is an opportunity for us to advance a human rights economy that places people's rights and the planet at the heart of economic policy, as the ministers said earlier. These new metrics have to measure whether growth benefits are fairly shared and whether growth leads to better investments in health, education, social protection, among other things. And we can achieve that by a selected number of human rights indicators related to fiscal policy, including, for example, a state's legal duty to raise and maximize resources for economic, social, and cultural rights. Fourth, it's essential that metrics avoid replicating old exclusions, that they capture things like unpaid care and support, and that they reveal both horizontal and vertical inequalities. That requires greater commitment and investment in human rights data, disaggregation, enhanced training for statisticians, and more robust national statistical systems. Fifth, we believe that integrating the right to development in the new metrics is essential because it gives effect to extraterritorial states' human rights obligations, including with regard to the impact of economic and climate decisions on other countries. And as a foundation for all of that, I'd like to close by emphasizing that the process has to be inclusive of civil society and of groups that are often marginalized, including indigenous peoples who often bear the brunt of harmful economic decisions driven solely by growth considerations. So we look forward to contributing to those metrics as they're developed and grounded in human rights, as I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Higgs, for reminding us what is at stake and the current human rights consequences our current systems have, but also the solutions that these universal rights offer us. Professor Hoekstra, you've worked extensively linking economic, social, and environmental dimensions for measurement. If a successful Beyond GDP framework is adopted, and actually I should say when a successful Beyond GDP measurement is adopted, what kind of changes would that bring, and to who?
Right, it's working. Yes, I've been working on this topic since 2007, and so I feel really elated actually to be here also with a high-level expert group working on this topic. We really feel, I think, the momentum as a community. Now, to your question, like, who will it benefit? I think we've heard the question of people and planet quite a lot, but I think we can actually be a little bit more precise, and I think it's the adjectives that are in the title that are helping us to focus more on the invisible side of the things. So inclusive really tells us about the people either globally or within nations that are left behind. And the sustainable is very much related to future generations. And that's why I think the youth being involved in this discussion is also so interesting. So I think it's not just people, but it's very much also focusing on the inclusivity and the sustainable part. Now, it's very hard at the end of a panel to say something original, but I'm going to try. First, what we've been discussing, I think a couple of us, is decision-making tools. And if we look at GDP, the role of GDP in our society after the Second World War, it was basically built on the system of national accounts. And that gave us retrospective statistics to actually look at how our societies were doing. And built on those system of national accounts, we also created macroeconomic models so that when policymakers had a question about a certain policy that they would want to implement, they could also have certain models that help them think through the models that they had. And I think the metric system does replace the first part of the decision making. So can we introduce these metrics into finance, into budget decisions? And I think the OECD has done a wonderful job of showing which countries are really developing there. I do think they also need to be linked to forward-looking models that we then build, because decision makers don't just want to know what's happened in the past, they also want a vision of the future. Now, the second thing I'd like to just add on to is a couple of us have talked about narratives and the role of metrics on narratives, and I really believe that that is a crucial part. I think very many people in the world do not know how GDP is measured. I don't know whether anybody in the room has read the recent SNA revision, which is 1,000 pages. Please raise your hand. So in a sense, it's not just about the metrics and the quality. It's actually about the narratives that we are capable of telling with these metrics. And GDP gave us this vision of growth is good, GDP is progress. And my hope is that by galvanizing actually the vast terminology that we have, the high-level expert group will also actually give us the words for these new narratives that are really necessary for the future. And I'm going to leave you with 7 seconds, Natalie.
Which is much appreciated. Thank you so much, and for still taking the time really to put inclusivity and sustainability at the center of our conversations again, and highlighting the importance of narratives. Mr. Amanu, from your experience, what should Beyond GDP metrics measure to reflect people's lived realities and drive, we've heard it, inclusive and sustainable economic transformation? What is the change we should pursue? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that question and for inviting the young person to be part of this panel. Well, in my view, as probably most the previous speakers already alluded to, GDP as we use it today takes a very presumptuous assumption that the root of welfare is the same across all countries. It assumes that societies achieve well-being through identical economic patterns. But when you think about it through the lived experience and also my professional experience, it appears that that is simply not the case. It actually confirms that in many societies or communities around the world, the reality on the ground is completely different. And in Uganda, for example, where I grew up from, much of what sustains life, a vast majority of it, exists outside the market. Most of the people live with very little money, but they do extremely immense amount of work, which is not necessarily paid. So all these people, if not most of them, are engaged in informal sector activities, whereby when you look at it in its sense, it's economically productive, but because there are no records or no monetization attached to it, they are invisible. They do not exist according to the current GDP metrics. All these people remain invisible, not because they do not do anything, but simply because there is no money exchanging hands among these individuals. So estimates currently place that unpaid labor in Uganda could represent up to 60% of the total economic output. A huge worrying number that shows you that the foundation of survival is actually not captured in the current metrics of progress. I know this for sure because of my personal experience and also professional experience. Growing up in Uganda, my grandmother, whose metrics do not actually appear in any GDP national reports, raised me and my siblings, taking on the responsibility in her own way, selling her small produce from her piece of land around the household, in the neighborhood, in the local market at home, to be able to fend for me and my siblings, providing for us accommodation, housing, that's the same thing. Clothing, and most important of all, to be able to take us to school. So I am the very product of this, what I call invisible economy. And from the experience, I say that it is sort of a very long form of hidden injustice that has been subjected to some parts of the world. When you see, for example, that my grandmother works every single day, all year round. Sometimes, if not most of the time, she actually wakes up before the sun. Every single day, all year round. But her contribution does not count according to the current GDP metrics. And she is not alone. There are millions of other Ugandans in the same boat with her. They are, in my view, and also from my experience, they are the foundation that build the economy itself. But it's like an invisible foundation that builds where everything else stands. But they do all this in form of, let's say, taking care of the children. But I think the biggest part of it, which is probably understated, is taking care of the elderly. There is no single home for old people in Uganda. But we do have old people, by the way. So all that labor is not monetized, and someone has to do it. So it doesn't reflect on the economic statistics. It doesn't reflect anywhere on the planet. But there is so much amount of work going on behind. And so are other half of the population in that. So I want to ask all of us here today a question. is it not an injustice that the hands that feed the nation are absent from the future that defines its progress? Is it really fair that the very people that make up the economy are excluded from the metrics of its progress? In my view, I think that GDP, and probably also most of the previous speakers have alluded to this, shows us only the tip of the iceberg, the part we can easily monetize, measure, record, but the very human dignity and the lives remains very unseen. So when you see that in the when they release statistics from the World Bank or from the country itself, and they say that Uganda's GDP is equivalent to $50 billion, that actually does not include the work of my grandmother and a half of the population, unfortunately. That is huge. That is very, very problematic. A woman whose contribution has immensely shaped society, that without her, actually, you unfortunately would not have me here speaking to you. Without her and the rest of the half of the population, there would be no future to measure in the first place to begin with. And so to ignore this for in a long time is only a loss for all of us. So I think that GDP appears to be politically safe, but it is very much economically blind. Because our countries are not necessarily poor because their people do too little. I think that countries are poor because these nations fail to see the work of their people. I want us to see us move beyond GDP urgently and quickly and or universally, as also earlier reiterated, put effort together, because this could help countries, especially in the global south, to be able to improve on their trust and integrity in the global stage. This would in turn earn them much more resources in terms of taxes from investments attracted, but also when these investments are created, it creates more employment or more people in the formal sector that could generate more taxes, which are very much needed, especially now that today with the aid problems, development financing problems or humanitarian financing problems around the world, because this money would be invested in the basics, infrastructure, education, healthcare, the very fundamentals of human dignity and development. So for me, we must all shift from valuing what is very easy to count to counting what we truly value as a society, ensuring that economic growth translates into freedom, opportunity, and the most important of all, justice for all of us. I speak today not only for my own behalf or on the behalf of the network on Beyond GDP. I speak also on the behalf of all young people out there in the world, asking the world not to stop measuring progress, really, but we are appealing that we should measure progress in a way that is better, but also in a way that reflects the reality and aspirations of the very people it seeks to serve. I beg to end here because of the time constraint, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amanu, for reminding us of actually these invisible foundations that allow for our shared progress and for this very strong call for the need for justice. And thank you to all panelists. Unfortunately, because of time, I will not be able to open the floor to questions, but I really hope that all panelists covered the most pressing issues. And with that, as we close our session, I would like to invite Professor Lustig, co-chair of the high-level expert group, to offer final reflections linking our discussion today to the UN processes. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. How long do I have? I forget. Okay, too bad. I mean, I hope that in some of my questions I reflect your views. If not, I think that, by the way, we have opened or are about to open our process to online consultation as well. So we invite everybody to go into our website and express your opinion. So it's pretty tough to try to summarize everything that has been said. So I am going to say a few things that caught my mind. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones, but I think that from His Excellency Dorji, I like the notion of balance. That's very important. Balance the material and the spiritual. Balance the individual with the society and the collective goals. That is absent. And, I want to ask a question to the OECD, this idea of having inclusive capitalism. Maybe, is capitalism able to be inclusive? I think it's a question that we usually, sort of skirt around it, and hopefully yes, because otherwise we're in trouble, because that's a dominant system, and that's what we need to strive. I think that from what you said, I take very seriously the government's things, the components that have to be present in order to achieve success with whatever beyond GDP framework we want to implement. The formal mechanisms are key to avoid disjointed decisions and help coordination. The use of the data, it's absolutely key, and I make a plea here to all the multilateral institutions. That's one of the key public goods, to continue investing in them. Usually the budgets are cut. They're going in the opposite direction. The third is independent accountability. It's fundamental, and an accountability that's also citizens-driven, not just governmental. I think from what Rebecca Greenspan said, it's a reminder that maybe it was not so emphatic when I made my presentation, that we're not trying to trash GDP and substitute it by something else, but we want to have indicators that will have the same prestige, I use the word prestige, and are salient as GDP into a future that go beyond. That's our goal. I think that I'm all in favor of the building capacity. As I said, that goes hand in hand with the production of data. It's not just production of data centrally produced, but also giving the capacity to countries to be able to produce the data themselves. Ambassador Wilson, I took several things from you, but one that sticks is maintaining those who agree with us and convincing those who don't. However, I think we need to be aware that there will be groups that we will not be able to convince, and we will need to go ahead even if we don't convince them. We need to find the mechanisms to do that, because you can't convince everybody. Now, we've seen that happening in practice in many countries in the world, but we need to continue pushing for what is possible to build on a consensus on the things that we agree. I also like the idea of putting debt as one of the key issues. I think that the debt, you mentioned the fact that debt is a problem because it takes away resources from investing in health, education, etc. So in the next generation, it also is a source of vulnerability in terms of economic stability, and you can have great outcomes like my country of birth, Argentina, and then you have huge crises and they become unsustainable. So I'm an expert in that, and that doesn't work. And that is one of the key variables. From Sabina, I think we're on the same page because we want actionable indicators. We want to be able to disaggregate within countries by the different groups that are considered to be important. That may vary depending on the country, of course. We strive not to be paternalistic. That's a challenge because, if you don't go preference-based, then what defines what's good? But we'll learn in the process. And very importantly, we'll try to incorporate measures that take into account no one left behind by introducing cumulative deprivations in some of our indicators. In terms of human rights, I think that we have to find which metrics can be a summary of the concerns that the very important constituency that's looking at development as a human right can be. I think we need to have a further dialogue because, especially, us that are from the economics profession sometimes do not capture what the human rights constituency is presenting, and I think it's very important that we converge into something that we think captures, so we will engage further. With Rutger, I completely agree that we need to have a narrative that is convincing. Words are very important, and we hope to find the words that resonate broadly. We are all tribes. We use our own lexicon in our tribes, so we have to find the Esperanto, if you want, that will work for our communications in terms of finding the narrative that is acceptable. Amano, you put on the table something that has kind of caused me a lot of dilemma, because you're absolutely right that an enormous amount of things that are happening in developing countries. My other country is Mexico. I have I have 3 citizenships now. And there, the amount of work that happens in the unpaid world, in the informal world, is tremendous. If you look at, the poor, about 1/3 of their consumption is home produced. If you don't account for it, then you may be thinking that they're poorer than what they are. However, we have to be careful. What does it mean then for the measure? I don't think we want to add all the informal and unpaid work to GDP, because then all the poor countries will be very rich, which is not what we're trying to do. We have to find a way in which all the unpaid work gets paid. What does it mean? Which are the mechanisms? And there are some policies that try to do that, like cash transfers, etc. But we have to do. I think we're on the same page in that respect, and that's going to be a challenge for us. And I want to also mention one thing. I believe that we will be concentrating on outcomes indicators. Then we will need a repertoire of effort indicators. What are governments doing to achieve something? But that would be maybe another high-level expert group that has to look at what would be the effort indicators and what would be the models. By the way, they can be micro, they don't have to be macro. And by the way, there's been a lot of progress on micro-simulation models that incorporate environmental issues that help us see what the trade-offs are and have quantities about that. One word that usually only economists bring to the table, and I want everybody to think about it because it affects the selection of indicators, it affects the resources that are used, etc. Trade-offs. Trade-offs exist, and we need to be able to make decisions. That's it. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Natalie.
You can actually leave it on. Okay. Thank you very much. And I think there's no better way to close a discussion by saying we need to continue to have this dialogue. So thank you so much for that. I will just say on behalf of the organizers, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the audience, both in person and online, including the Youth Network, and to all those who will continue driving the Beyond GDP agenda forward. And a special thank you to the organizers as well, in particular Ms. Anu Peltola, the Director of Statistics, for your leadership and vision for this event, the Beyond GDP agenda, and for championing youth engagement in that process. And a big thank you to my team as well, Christine and Julian. And I will also end with an ask if you could kindly clean up the room as the next event is starting right away. Thank you so much for joining.